2025 is the year of calypso. Trouble in town, trouble in town. Everybody paying tribute to calypso. Trouble in town, trouble in town. Listen, in the savannah, prepare for drama. It's bacchanal. Dedicated to Katrina, Alvin Roberts, the Grandmaster. The sunrise in the east. What's one down with
And very happy to believe that today we're not going to have trouble in town on this day with the arrival of Indian Prime Minister Sri Narendra Modi. And I'm very happy for us to be able to explore leadership in the East Indian community, especially through the lens of gender. Now, Dr. Sharian Singh is a UWI lecturer with research into the Indian diaspora, religion, and identity in Trinidad. Good morning, Dr. Singh. How you do?
Hi, good morning, Mr. Rostan. I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I consider myself blessed because this is actually the first of two conversations that we're supposed to be having today. This one via
Yeah.
Zoom, the second one should be in person. But I want us to start off, please, by describing, let's build it from the ground up. Let's look at some traditional models of leadership within the local East Indian community, and would they have evolved over time?
Yes. Now, leadership within the Indian community, I mean, India is a very old civilization. And if we're looking at what the Indians would have brought with them, of course, they would have brought elements and ideas about leadership from India itself. Um, those ideas would have been very ancient, or at least located in the ancient Indian period. There is a text on leadership and kingship and so on, known as the Arthasastra, and elements and teachings and ideas and concepts from that text would have been brought down and, of course, changed over time. But within the specifically Indian diaspora context within Trinidad, um, the leaders would have been working on a mixture of various what we can call styles if we want to formalize it. So what the Indians would have brought with them would have been, let's say, two levels of leadership. They would have brought with them ideas of leadership at, let's say, that higher, more visible level, in terms of kings and emperors and what one would expect of that at that stage of leadership. They would have also brought with them the kind of leadership that they were more directly connected to, and that would have been leadership at the village level, because most of the indentured laborers would have come from villages. Um, so at the village level, you had the various forms of leadership. You had what you might call the village headmen, you had the landlords or the zamindars, and also most predominant in this Trinidad diaspora or the West Indian diaspora context would have been that system known as the panchayat. Now, that panchayat was a system that operated within each village. Each village would have had its own panchayat, usually comprising of five main members. Over time in the diaspora, the number and the composition and the criteria for selecting leaders would have changed. So traditionally, it comprised in India five members. Selection of leaders would have been based on usually the eldest males in the village, based on their knowledge, their wealth, their status, and so forth. But within the diaspora, um, in the indenture period on the plantations, while there wasn't the scope or the room or the time even for that formal panchayat to emerge, you did have ideas. So, for example, on an estate, usually the colonial authorities are not concerned with what happens within the community once the work gets done. So among themselves on each estate, the Indians would have formed this sort of informal, if you want to call it, not really a panchayat, but an informal grouping with the leaders, and they would have used that to solve their own internal problems. And as they moved off the estates and community reconstruction started to take place, then this system of the panchayat would eventually be reconstructed to an extent. But of course, in this new context, you would have changes. For example, the criteria for selection would change over time. So by the time we got to the 19, let's say 30s or 40s, a criteria such as one of the criterion such as being able to speak English or having knowledge of the English language would be a factor of consideration for leadership, because then you're engaging a larger society, a larger English speaking society. Um, um, there were differences now within this construction of leadership, where within this panchayat system, where now it might have been a minority, but even women were allowed. I've been told of certain panchayats where, because communities were, you had predominantly Indian communities, but there were those that comprised Indians and people of other ethnicities like Africans and so forth. So there were about two panchayats I've heard of where you had members of the African community belonging to that village panchayat. Not the norm, an exception, but definitely quite interesting. So what I would say about Indian leadership generally, whether it was in the diaspora context, as in Trinidad, within the context of the panchayat, is that Indian leadership has never been a singular, what you can call monolithic concept. It's more a blend of styles, yeah? And, whatever the style, whether autocratic, democratic, there is always a place for or role for traditional values, spiritual principles within that construction of leadership. There is always an emphasis on serving. That leader must be in service of the people. Gandhi would have been one of the main proponents of this style of leadership, the concept of what is known as seva, or selfless service. So the leader is central. He leads the people, but he is there for the people, looking after the collective good. So he is a servant. Then there will be also elements in this concept of leadership that emerge in the diaspora of what we might call loosely a rishi. Rishis were the Sanskrit term for the Indian sages and saints who led their society by virtue of their wisdom, religious knowledge, and so forth. So that style of leadership, their emphasis is on moral values, spiritual wisdom, and the leaders are expected also to exhibit those qualities. Um, then you have what you can call formally more transformational kind of leadership, that they motivate their followers by appealing to higher ideals and values and so on. And you have many, other models, democratic, autocratic, and so forth. But whatever model, and as I said, it's more a blend of models. In reality, it's never a singular model. The key qualities of Indian leaders and leadership would be their focus on their people, a strong social emphasis, flexible leadership styles, and of course, ethical conduct. A strong emphasis on ethical values and integrity is, almost like a hallmark, so to speak, of Indian leadership. And of course, spiritual values, tradition, and the focus on people. I would think that would, in a nutshell, kind of speaks to the quality of leadership or the definitions of leadership within the diaspora. But as I said, remember the terms flexibility.
And with that, though, there is a, if we have the time, be very happy for us to explore the concept that you speak of Indianness, and because I'm listening to what it is you're saying in terms of engaging with a larger society. What are some of the things that you would take from that, be it being able to speak English? Is it a matter of nature, nurture, comparison? Is one person more Indian than another? But even before we get into that, though, I want to ask about the role of women. And this is religious community leadership, reinterpretations of figures like Sita, and how has that helped to define what it is women can see themselves doing and actually achieve using these examples and influences?
Okay, so speaking to the role of women or Indian women, um, to understand it today, we go back a bit. Um, yes, the Indian women who came from India, they came breaking stereotypes right away. A lot of the Indian women came as single women. They came to, and I'm using Trinidad, but the general diaspora, indentured diaspora context, they came to create lives for themselves. They came as workers. So right away, we see qualities such as strength, such as independence, hardworking, having to carve out a life for themselves, whatever means, little means, sometimes no means at all. Um, and of course, after indentureship, you have, you know, gradually a different dynamic coming into play where community was being reconstructed. And of course, now in that reconstruction of community, um, Indians would look to India for models and structures and systems that they could follow, that they could base this community construction on. And of course, those models also would extend to women. All right. So there was a change from gradual change, of course. The kind of woman, or the notion of the Indian woman that applied during indentureship to what would now apply, and now meaning 1920s, 30s, 40s, during this period of reconstruction. So what you saw happening then was an emphasis now on recreating that system in India, and that system in India would have been more based on the patriarchy norms and values of patriarchy. So during the early post-indenture period, you had that sense of women changing. Now women are falling back into that patriarchal system. So you get ideas, patriarchal based ideas such as a woman should be at home. Whether at home or not, Mr. Rasta, the thing is, women were always working. Yeah. So they were at home. There were certain restrictions. They, for example, could not take part in certain religious practices and so forth because of the fact that they were women. When you dug deeper, then you might get reasons such as, women just can't do it. At that time, that would be enough explanation. You get responses such as, okay, related to menstruation and its impurity and so on. So restrictions, the role of women definitely changed from the indentureship period to this early post-indenture. And then, of course, you look at, let's say, fast forward to the 1990s, or even a bit before that, when factors, and of course, as you mentioned, factors connected to the larger society. Because yes, in the early indenture period, we can say that many of the Indian communities that emerged in 1920s, 30s, 40s almost live like in a little vacuum, very self-sufficient rural-based communities. So it was not difficult to recreate this sort of space, a patriarchal sort of space where women, sorry, had a certain had to basically fit in, but also navigating that space to find agency for themselves, and to maneuver the situations. But of course, fast forward to the 1990s, you have factors such as, rise in education of women becoming financially independent. And I must add, once again, because they were financially independent during the indenture period, you had a change in the approach to religion in the sense that now it's no longer blind adherence to religion. It's a more generally across the board, a more philosophical, probing approach to religion. So answers pertaining to the role of women and the position that says, well, you know, women should not do that because the scriptures say so. Women should not do that because that's how our ancestors did it. Those would not suffice anymore. So it's more, so
And it's
now when you look
definitely,
for those
and to
answers.
cut in a little bit, and it's definitely something that has been evolving in terms of some people talk about gender normative behavior, but definitely we have seen an evolution and a progression to the point where we have Prime Minister Kamala Persad-Bissessar serving a second term as Prime
Yeah.
Minister. And I want to ask, though, with that context that you would have set, how does this meeting of the Prime Minister of India and the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago look like to you? And this is through, and I'll call it a gendered lens. And what are some of those factors or the parameters that you use to come to that conclusion?
I think this meeting says a lot. It speaks of the meeting, it gives you a situation of a son of Indian soil meeting, let's say, a daughter of the diaspora, of the Indian diaspora, or a granddaughter, so to speak, figuratively speaking, of India. It definitely speaks of, of that. Of where we are now in terms of the space that women occupy, that equality, that parity, because here we have the meeting of a male Indian prime minister to look at it through the gendered lens, and the female Indian prime minister, and they're meeting on that platform, that level platform, where no one is going to judge them, and I hope no one is going to judge them based on their gender. They are going to be looked at in terms of the qualities of a leader, what's expected, how much they can fulfill the expectations placed on them. Um, I do think also no one is going to say, well, okay, we expect X from Prime Minister Bisesa and Y from Prime Minister Modi simply because one is male, one is female. That would not be the case. I do think that coming together speaks a lot for, let's deal with the Indian community, where it reminds, it invokes the memories of where the Indian people came from. That is to say, the situation in India that brought the indentured laborers to the Caribbean. So, indentured laborers, our ancestors and forefathers, they came from a very downtrodden India. And now, an India space that was left like that because of British rule. And now here you have Prime Minister Modi now visiting this land of Trinidad, where you have an Indian community that grew out of those kinds of conditions. And so it is a situation, a moment of immense pride for Indians in Trinidad to see, Prime Minister Modi now, he has emerged, India has emerged from what it was during the colonial period. So Prime Minister Modi represents that new, that glorious India. He is almost, like this hero figure that has emerged from that situation. And now he's coming to meet uh, Prime Minister Bisesa, who is, like a hero, similar to him, but in the diaspora context. So on both sides, it represents that emergence of Indian civilization, both in India and in its diaspora. And they're now coming together. So it is, I think it's a situation of immense pride, put aside, what is hoped to be achieved in terms of agreements and investments and so forth. But I think culturally and in terms of identity, it impacts deeply on the Indo-Trinidadian population, and might I say also the larger Trinidadian population. There's so many levels that it impacts on.
And we get to explore some of those levels a little bit in person this afternoon with you before the arrival of the Indian Prime Minister. And I really appreciate that point that you would have made, as opposed to expectations because of gender, looking at qualities of character and how much you can fulfill expectations placed upon you. Dr. Sherry-Ann Singh, we want to thank you so much for spending some time with us this morning, and saying thanks in advance for the time you're going to be spending with us this afternoon. Dr. Sherry-Ann Singh, a lecturer, Indian History and Indian Diaspora Studies at the UWI St. Augustine campus. The Now Morning Show returns after this. Stay with us.
He's coming later, but I'm on radio right now too, so. You're working for me. You're working for me. He what?